Our season continues in the dimly lit caves of the Endor forest. Malik was lugging a clone commando with green armor up to the top of the cave. His men were all trying to find the artifact that Malik had in possession. He dropped the clone and told them to return to the base, lock the clone up, and prepare to evacuate the planet. Malik had no means of making the clones play a game with him. He was going to get out of Dodge, take his artifact back to his master, and leave Endor. The clone commando was just a distraction. As he prepared to inform the fleet that he was ready to return with the artifact in stow, he realized the communication systems were down. It seems as if the clones were smarter than he initially realized. The only way the clones could shut down his communication system is if they had a vessel on planet. With nighttime fully taking effect on the forest moon, Malik ordered his men to fan out, find their vessel, and destroy it. At the same time, he had a number of troopers hit the clone commando and tie him to a tree. Malik wasn't concerned with the commando. His main concern was getting away from the planet. He just hoped his men could find the commando's ship and destroy it soon. In the cave system, Scorch told Boss that he was able to block their communications, though he warned that the surge could likely inform the Sith flagship that there was something going on the ground. Boss asked how much time they had, and he said they probably had around 2 hours at most. Anything past that would be miraculous. Sev lifted a couple rocks off of Boss and he climbed to his feet. His leg was injured. Sev told Boss that he should stay back or get to the ship while he and Scorch go and find Fixer and the artifact. The lead commando looked up and adjusted his helmet's visor. It was knocked loose from the rocks falling down onto them. Boss didn't say a word. He grabbed a couple of rocks and pulled some fabric from under his suit and wrapped it around his name. It would work as a stint for the time being. That's all that mattered. He was light on his one leg, but he turned to the group and told them to prepare to move out. There were a couple of Ewoks with them. It's a shame Fixer had been taken. He had all the communication information, so they'd have to use rudimentary communication with the Ewoks. But because the other Ewoks were with them, they would be able to hopefully inform the tribe of what happened. Because not for nothing, for the surviving Ewoks, they were not a fan of seeing their friend cut in half. They pulled at Boss's hand, and the three commandos gathered everything they had up and moved out. The Ewoks, despite not having a conception of galactic time, were pressed to get to the top side and begin their hunt. Boss, Scorch, and Sev followed closely behind, their boots clambering across the hard floors of the cave until they reached the dirt. The air around them became more open. The clones with their night vision could see the cave around them vanish as they exited through the mouth of the cave. The Ewoks turned back and pointed up. By this point, they pretty much assumed that the commandos could see what they were doing. Despite being such primal animals with sticks and bows, they are incredibly smart. The Ewoks were able to drag the clones back around to the tree line they were initially in and get the clones up to the top of their base. Boss told Sev to work his way around the edge of the trees and see if he could find a good readout of the enemy base. They would need everything they could if they wanted to get a chance of rescuing their friend and stopping the artifact from returning to enemy hands. Boss listened to the Ewoks they were with, explained everything to their tribal leader. Of course, he didn't know what was being said, but he waited eagerly. It was hard to be patient. There was a ticking clock and they had to get on the move quickly. But he also needed help from the Ewoks. It wasn't that Delta wasn't able to excel in a challenge even with 2.5 members, it was more so that the Ewoks knew the land much better, and despite having scouted it out earlier in the day, they didn't memorize it. While the commandos were some of the best there were, when a planet went from day to night, the scenery could feel a lot different, and for clones on a mission like this, that difference could be life and death. The Ewoks would be able to get them help, and get them through their challenges that sat before them. Minutes passed by and Sev was in position, his visor was lit up, analyzing everything on the ground with his rifle. Night vision was such an advantage for the clones, and Sev was constantly reporting to Boss where the Sith troopers were, but he didn't know how many were out there. He then remembered the bug that was planted on one of the troopers, and called over to Scorch and asked if he could get a readout on it. Scorch ran over to Sev and got down next to him. He told his brother that he didn't have the device to tap into it, but he might be able to gather a signal from Fixer's device, if it was still activated, and then they could transmit everything back up here. Sev continued to monitor the position as Scorch quickly moved through his backpack, finding the device he needed to try and patch into Fixer's bug transplant. Sev still hadn't found Fixer yet, and he was genuinely nervous if he wouldn't be able to find him or if he'd been killed. Those words were put to rest when a ringing sounded from a lower tree line. Scorch panicked and tried to stop the signal, but he was able to pick up a couple snippets of conversation between Malik and the operation commander. Malik was getting impatient. He wanted to know if the troops found the commando vessel. Then he heard the ringing. Malik grabbed his lightsaber and started forward towards the sound of the ringing. Sev told Scorch to cut the signal. They had the information they needed. Scorch said he was trying, but it wasn't working. Fixer, who was tied to the tree, got super nervous as one of the Sith troopers came up to him and whacked him in the head, knocking him out completely. Fixer, being knocked out again, slumped over. Sev muttered some expletives under his breath and got up. He told Scorch to come along with him. Malik extinguished his weapon and returned to the camp. When they got to Boss, they informed him of everything going on, and that the Sith were looking for the vessel. Boss told Scorch to return to the ship and have the engines ready to go. Scorch shook his head. He told Boss that he should do it. Scorch could go with the Ewoks and help them from the ground, and Sev could help from above. Boss thought for a moment. He didn't want to admit it, but Scorch was right. He couldn't be slowing them down. He nodded his head and knelt down to the chief of the tribe and pointed to himself and then gestured to Scorch and Sev as if he was trying to say that the chain of command was being passed on. The Ewoks didn't really understand, but once Boss got up and started away as fast as he could, they kind of got the picture. The chief let out a couple ooga boogas, and a number of Ewoks jumped up and got on the move. They grabbed spears, rocks, bows, and anything else they could get their hands on. The Ewok leader grabbed Scorch's knee piece and waved it forward. Sev nodded his head at Scorch and ran back to his lookout position. The Ewoks descended the trees and made their way down to the rock structure above the Sith camp. Scorch watched as a number of the little man-eating monsters spread out. This was without direction or even without a word spoken. Not for nothing, Scorch was a little freaked out. While the Ewoks were cute and cuddly, something about them at night made them nightmarish. As Scorch and the chieftain got into position, he radiated over to Boss to ask if he was there. The lead commando sounded like he was in pain, wincing over the comms and telling Scorch and Sev that he was just outside the ship. He didn't want to enter until it was entirely necessary. Everything became quiet. The chieftain tugged on Scorch's hand and pulled him down a little. Scorch looked over and knelt down. The Ewok pointed out and gave some more hand signals back. Scorch nodded his head like he knew what was going on, but he had no clue. Out in the trees, he could hear the Sith troopers running around. They were fanning out into the forest to find the clone vessel. Malik was furious, but he knew that it would be a matter of time until he got off this rock. He turned to the table inside the command room and looked at the bone. He began to analyze it, but he didn't know what he was looking at. There were weird carvings on the side of the bone, but none of it made any sense. His hope was that Revan might be able to figure out what it was once he returned to the flagship. Malik's men were still running through the brush. The sounds of the forest had been lively every single night they had been here, but as the men traversed into the brush, it was eerily silent. One of the leads of a pack of troops stopped. He told his group to fan out, look around and see if they could find the ship the clones arrived on. Their boots were walking along the hard ground, and they were snapping branches and tripping on rocks. Despite their technology, they didn't have anything more than flashlights. They scanned the area. Nothing to be seen. One of the men stopped and looked around the tree, and moments later, he disappeared. Though none of the Sith troopers noticed, they could hardly see a foot in front of them. All of their movements were unsteady, and they didn't know where they were going. While the men were walking around, one of them stepped on a branch, and it masked the sound of a neck snapping in the distance. The group came out with 10 troops, just as most of the units had. They didn't realize they were down 2 men, and then from the distance out towards the base, they heard a horn sound. Despite the Sith having burnt some of the forest down, they hadn't had any interactions with the Ewoks on a battle level. It's not that the Ewoks wouldn't fight back, it's that the incidents were so isolated that most of the troops hadn't even seen the Ewoks during their duration on Endor. The men all turned back and looked around. They realized that someone was missing from their group. One of the others called out saying that it's more than just a someone, before the sound of a man losing his breath caught their attention. It was all so quick. All the troopers turned over and instinctively opened fire. One of the other men dropped to the ground in the middle of them. The rest of them turned around to see a vibroblade stuck in his neck. From behind the men, Boss leapt out and swept under one of them, lifting him off their feet by grabbing a hold of their feet and thrusting upwards. Boss sent the trooper on his head, killing him instantly. He moved quickly, sliding his pistol into one of their side and pulling the trigger once, twice, thrice, and then he vanished. Boss hid in the brush as they all turned around. He limped up to the tree and got behind cover as one of the men in the group, scared beyond belief, opened fire into the emptiness of the night and clipped one of his teammates. With the chaos, the elite clone commander slid around the tree using his hands to kill one more, and before they could react, his vibroblade was attached to his wrist again, and he took down the remaining members and vanished into the night like a ghost. On the other side of the forest, Sev watched from up above as a group of men walked into an Ewok trap. The sound of the battle horn pushed this group of men into a circle. They backpedaled and stood at each other's backs, their weapons, their flashlights facing outwards. Out from the trees, a couple wisty pouches landed in their faces and they were blinded. A trap meant to capture animals clutched their legs and dragged them up into a massive net. The men cried out and their screams could be heard across the forests. The Ewoks descended onto them, launching spears and arrows into the nets. One of the men lived, but faking his death would only provide an even more traumatic outcome for when this assault was over with. Boss raided over the communications and told them that it had been 45 minutes. They needed to be wary. He then ordered them to get Fixer immediately. They could then go for the artifact and bounce. Sev acknowledged this, and so did Scorch. But they probably still had a good 100 to 150 troopers in the area. They couldn't risk a head-on assault. Scorch was prepared for anything, but he didn't want to burn the Ewoks' home down. That wouldn't be kind of him to do, especially not after they were so helpful to them. Out from the forest, another horn whistled, and a boulder dropped down, and the men inside the caves cried out as they were all crushed by the boulder rolling down on them. Those who were injured or not killed were hunted down by the vicious pack of Ewoks. The chieftain and Scorch moved down the hill and into the area outside the camp. Troopers across the trees were being hunted down by the Ewoks, and they were getting spread out. It was a terrifying experience, especially for those who got separated from their groups. They ran into the forests, avoiding any extra noise they heard. Again, being that the forest was deathly silent, every noise was extremely audible. The animals of Endor feared the Ewoks. They were the dominant apex hunter on the planet. Those troops who got separated were either killed on the spot or hit with a bundle of rope and rocks that tied their legs and dropped into the ground. Then they were killed. The Ewoks were preparing a feast for themselves. As everything was seemingly going perfect, Seth picked up on something on his radar. A shuttle descended into the forest near the base. He didn't know if it would be a good idea, but he told Scorch that if he could get outside their little base, he might be able to retrieve the artifact. The Ewoks were currently working to fix her, but he was still knocked out and he was surrounded by a guard of troops. The shuttle that landed opened up and a couple of acolytes exited. Their survival was surprising despite the battle that took place on the flagship a couple days beforehand, but they exited and looked into the forest line. Sev knew this would put them into a severely disadvantageous spot. He told Scorch to brace for impact. Scorch asked what that meant, but before he could question it, Sev pulled the trigger and a blast slid right into the camp next to where the ship landed. The blaster bolt clipped the collection of explosives the Sith had been using to dig out the cave, and ripped an explosion into the side of the shuttle, destroying it. Sev told Scorch to get the artifact. When the explosion sounded off, Malik was thrown into the side of the little barricade, and a number of debris fell onto him. Bost asked what was happening, but Sev didn't say a word. He targeted one of the acolytes who had survived and clipped him in the head before scanning the area to make sure everything else was all clear. Bost told the crew that he would return, and as the words left his mouth, horns sounded, and the sound of the Ewoks from around the trees echoed out in one massive chorus. Scorch told Bost that he might want to hang back a little bit, though this chorus was not the beginning of an all-out assault. It was a fear tactic. With the Sith base in ruins, the Sith had to flee into the forest. The troopers, who were guarding Fixer, unlatched him from the tree and dragged him into the forest, his feet leaving a trail in the dirt as the Sith troopers looked for a safe place to stay. At the Sith base, a number of Sith troopers reorganized to search for the artifact and the Sith apprentice who was here. Scorch knew he needed to get the artifact, and he ran up to the wreckage of the wall. It was in shambles, but it provided cover for him. The only issue is, the fire made his position more visible. It gave the Sith troopers a sense of lighting. Sev radioed down to Scorch and told him it was clear to move in. At the same time, a couple of Ewoks could be heard getting shot. The fires outside the base were providing a sense of visibility for the inept troopers of the Sith. Sev tried to keep an eye out for the Ewoks, but it was incredibly difficult, mostly because he was trying to find Fixer and keep Scorch safe. The Ewoks were on the hunt of Fixer, but the Sith troopers were finally starting to get a grip on themselves. But the Ewoks were always prepared by launching whiskey pouches at their foes, though due to the magnitude of their numbers, only a couple of them were hit by a loose arrow. For the most part, some of the Sith were lodging down in cover. Some of them were hiding in rock formations and others were in the caves. Most of them were still out in the open, but it wasn't easy. Sev told Scorch that the artifact was in the Rebel, or at least he thought it was. He gave a precise location of what he believed was the artifact they came here for. Scorch rolled around the corner and kept his rifle primed. He could see the Sith, but they didn't suspect him coming, despite the raging fires next to him. Scorch reached down and pulled the shiny object out. It wasn't it. As he stood back up, he was blasted in the shoulder piece and fell back. Sev opened fire from the tree line. It was someone who was out of Sev's view, hidden by the wreckage of the barracks. Scorch stumbled back and Sev blasted away at the Sith troopers, who began to notice the intruder in their wreckage of camp. They knew what the clones were looking for. Scorch ran back to the ramparts he was behind as he held his shoulder and looked over and saw a couple dozen troopers running his way. Sev ducked out of the way as blaster fire aimlessly made its way to his location. He tried killing all the troopers, but it was increasingly difficult now that they noticed him, somewhere in the tree line. Sev grabbed the rope and looked for a safe dismount location. At the same time, the Ewoks from the brush ambushed the troopers that were charging at Scorch. Scorch rolled back over and opened fire on the troops inside the camp. He was able to lay down heavy ordnance, which sadly was not laced with explosives. They needed that bone. The men who were in the forest charging Scorch let out screams of terror. The Ewoks hunted them down and left them running for their lives, but the Ewoks were not merciful to intruders. Sev took the sniper configuration off his blaster and grabbed a rope in front of him and told himself, "Here goes nothing," as he jumped down. The rope didn't catch. He panicked as he felt the floor of the forest come to him at a faster rate than he could have ever imagined. The air flung past him and he held his breath, bracing for impact, and then it caught, launching him forward. Sev let out a woohoo and then leaned his rifle to his side and opened fire. He called the Sith troopers some expletives as he sped to the forest floor in a blaze of glory. Sev hit the ground and rolled. He moved between the Ewoks who were hunting down the Sith in the forest. His blade clipped a couple of the troopers before he blasted one in the head. He didn't want to shoot all these individuals while he was coming down. He didn't want to risk the Ewoks. He then turned his attention towards the burning base and told Scorch he was moving in, asking him to provide cover fire. The Ewoks dispersed back into the brush. The glistening crimson colors on Sev's uniform shined as he moved forward. Scorch watched with awe as Clone Wick did what he did best. He committed acts of war crimes against his enemies. He ran through the fire like a man possessed and blasted away at the Sith troopers. The cover fire from Scorch helped as well. The troopers started to drop, and Sev leapt down and rolled through a patch where there was no fire. The Sith troopers didn't know that. All they saw was a clone commando dip into the fire and rise. The markings of what appeared to be blood across his mask and armor petrified them. This was a terrifying sight. Sev threw his blade out into one of them, and lifted his right arm, blasting his rifle, and with his left, he pulled out his pistol and fired away at them. Most clones were more practiced with ambidextrous skills than a regular trooper, and Sev proved it in this moment. The Sith dropped to the ground, and Sev put his weapons away and quickly grabbed the blade and put it away too. He looked quickly and called over to Scorch. The other commando followed closely behind, and they searched for the artifacts. They lifted up pieces of debris, hoping that it hadn't been destroyed. They scoured the commander's tent for minutes until they found them. Scorch picked them up, and Sev covered his back, making sure he was clear as they ran through the wreckage. Scorch attached the bone to his belt and let it dangle, as the other ones were tossed to his backpack. Sev told Boss they needed to find Fixer, and he acknowledged. He was currently leaning against the ship, but it was getting increasingly hard for him to stand. Sev and Scorch looked for the Ewoks, but aside from the burning trees and gear, the force was silent again. The two commandos moved forward, keeping their eyes and their weapons prepared. They were grabbed by a couple of Ewoks and brought down into the brush. The Ewok leader of the group spoke quietly to the two of them, but they didn't retain anything. They just followed the hand movement. Sev looked over, and so did Scorch. They could see a bundle of Sith troopers hiding behind a couple of rocks. Scorch asked if he could see Fixer, and he shook his head. There was no sign of him. Sev turned to Scorch, who was already doing the Force's work. Sev waved the Ewoks back. As Sev did, he crushed a tree branch and fell over. The Sith troopers opened fire into the brush. It was chaotic, but there was a massive log protecting them. Scorch called out to the Sith and told them to think fast before he launched a rocket into their laps. The explosion launched the 24 men into the air as the Ewoks let out what sounded like cheers. In the distance, another one of the troopers was clearly found by the Ewoks as a scream echoed out and vanished like a whisper. Sev and Scorch got to their feet and looked around. The Ewoks were sniffing the air. They were hunting. The Ewoks collected up and moved forward. They were on the trail. Sev and Scorch knew that wherever they were going next would likely be the last of the troops. The screams from the force had been silenced again, and all that was left was a congregation of Ewoks and commandos moving to save their friend and recapture their home. The movements were quick, and then the Ewoks stopped at the mouth of the cave. Scorch looked in, and they could see the Sith troopers. They went in together and lit some torches to keep the inside of the cave lit. The Ewoks looked in, and the commandos shook their head. They pointed at themselves. They knew it'd be useless to go in there with the Ewoks. They would get slaughtered. They didn't want that. The Ewoks had been kind enough to the clones, and if it wasn't for their help, they wouldn't have been able to get this much done in this short period of time. Sev and Scorch looked to each other, and then looked back at the Ewoks. Sev cupped his hand and pretended to throw dust. The Ewoks twisted their heads and grabbed some dirt and did the same motion. The Ewoks looked at each other, and then they held out their little pouches of demon lights. Sev nodded his head, and asked if they could borrow them. Scorch shook his head. Sev completely forgot they didn't speak Galactic Common. He gestured to the pouch and then to his hand. The chieftain said something, and the collection of Ewoks came up to him, depositing their pouches. Sev grinned under his helmet, and asked Scorch if he had anything in his arsenal that wouldn't be explosive. Fixer was likely down there, and they didn't have time to risk. That Sith apprentice would likely be back up and mobile in the coming minutes. He didn't know, but he didn't want to find out. Scorch looked through and found some concussion bombs. They'd be a real headache. Sev just looked at Scorch. Scorch thought it was funny, and then Sev told him to prepare the weapons. They collectively turned around and looked at the mouth of the cave. Sev told Scorch to throw the concussions. They could use the pouches once they got into the cave, though they had to be careful of friendly fire. Scorch agreed, and the two of them were prepared. The Ewoks lined the exterior. If any troops tried to escape, it would be a death trap. The only reason the clones couldn't go the back way is it would take way too long, and the boulder that crushed a number of troops was blocking the entrance from the other side. If they blew it up, it could hurt Fixer, which again is something they didn't want. The commandos loaded up and launched the concussions into the cave. The Sith were thrown for a loop, but they turned around and opened fire at the mouth of the cave. The commandos had already gotten down there and were hiding behind the rock walls. Sev and Scorch called out to each other. They couldn't identify where Fixer was. Sev told Scorch to aim high and fire away. They reached their blasters over their shoulders and opened up. The Sith troopers started dropping, and once the smoke from the concussion slipped away, which there wasn't much to begin with, Sev and Scorch launched some of their pouches. The Sith troopers cried out, and Scorch rounded the corner and found Fixer as he ducked behind another rock, though it was smaller than he initially thought, so he had to lay it down, basically to stay hidden. Sev was given Fixer's whereabouts as he slid around the corner and blasted away, before putting a blade to Fixer's restraints and allowing the clone commando to take action. He grabbed his rifle and opened fire. The Sith were being pushed back and they had no means to escape. Sev told Fixer to run. As he did, he ran up to the mouth of the cave and panicked. The Ewoks had vacated and he looked at the man from across the tree line standing in front of the fires. He was holding a lightsaber. Malik looked unsteady, and he wavered just a little bit by standing. Scorch and Sev were still in the cave, and Fixer raised his blaster. Sev used his blade to cut down a couple of Sith troopers after telling Scorch to get out of the cave. Scorch got up and ran. Sev used the body of one of the victims as a human meat shield as he ascended the cave backwards. Scorch stood next to his brother as they looked at the Sith who approached them. Scorch told Fixer to watch this as he launched a rocket at Malik, but the Sith used the Force and threw it away. Fixer looked over at Scorch. Even without seeing his face, Scorch knew exactly the face that Fixer was using. Scorch shrugged his shoulders and aimed his weapon. Sev exited the cave and he dropped the body and turned to see his brothers facing off with the Sith. Malik yelled out at them. He told them that they would pay for what they did here. Fixer told the Sith that they would only be so lucky. Not a second passed before Boss flew the Republic shuttle by and blasted the ground in front of Malik, sending him through the air and crashing into a tree. Boss opened up the ramp and the three clones quickly entered. They had each other and their artifacts as Boss lifted up and launched away. They weren't done yet. A wing of fighters was coming down to investigate the lack of response from the shuttle. The shuttle was sent down blindly with no understanding of anything going on the ground. Fixer ran up to the co-pilot's seat and he helped take control of the vessel as he piloted through the trees, avoiding the fighters. As they approached a massive tree, they pulled back, lobbing the shuttle upwards and allowing a fighter to slam into the tree behind them. Fixer spun the shuttle around. Thankfully, Scorch and Sev were strapped in. They piloted the ship forward with all the rear shields and engines active. It was full power to those different parts of the ship as they piloted out of the atmosphere while constantly dodging attacks made by the fighters behind them. Fixer told Boss to make the jump, and Boss grabbed the controls and shoved them forward as their shuttle departed from the Endor system, back to the Republic fleet over Bespin. Malik looked up into the sky and his skin trembled. He looked at Revan's shuttle slip down between the trees and over the fire. A number of the survivors ran out of the cave and the Ewoks watched from a distance. Revan stormed down the ramp of his ship and called out Malik's name with a yell as a number of the men from the cave came running out and got to their knees before Revan. Despite being a Sith Lord, Revan wasn't wasteful. These survivors would be more than motivated the next time a battle came. The trauma of this battle and their loss would motivate them to not fail again. The same did not go for a student, the arrogant fool who lost to a bundle of teddy bears, and whoever was inside that Republic shuttle that just lifted from the system would pay the price. Malik crawled out from the brush, his robes covered in char and his face covered in burnt scars. Revan told the troopers to get inside his vessel and wait for him. Malik told Revan that the clones used the Ewoks in the darkness against them. Revan kicked Malik and told him that he didn't want excuses, he wanted results. The fact that Malik was bested by clones made this all the more insufferable for him. Doesn't matter if they were the best unit in the Grand Army of the Republic, he was bested by beings created inside of test tubes, and that was a crime he would pay for. Revan electrocuted his student, and his agonies only reflected what filled the night air on Endor for countless moments beforehand. In space, Delta Squad got in contact with Even Keel and Captain Tarkin. They informed them that they were successful in their mission. However, the Sith were now alerted to their presence, due to circumstances unrelated to their operation. This was a half-lie, but they didn't want to get in trouble with Tarkin. The captain spoke up, preparing to rip into the clones, but Even Keel spoke over him, and told the clones that they did well. He told them to return to the fleet, and once they docked into Hangar Bay, they would be relocating. The war was this much closer to a resolution, thanks to them. And that, my friends, is our episode. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons: Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William, 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Ban, Colin Rooney, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Anakinskywalker Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngly Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Border 6 Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, the Many Three First Names, Darksaint46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. If you want to support me other ways, go check out the Patreon. All the things are down below. Otherwise, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.